Welcome friends to this new session. Today we are going to talk about arms race. Now arms race is a kind of a race which happens between two countries when both these countries try to increase the size and the quality of military resources which they have to gain some kind of military and political superiority over their adversary. The classic example of arms race was the Cold War arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, which was perhaps the largest and the most expensive arms race in the history of humankind. However, there have been other arms races, for example, the race in the field of armaments between India and Pakistan. But all these arms races usually end up in some very dire consequences. Now, however, all arms races would not necessarily lead to a situation of war. For example, the arms race during the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union was as I mentioned, a very expensive arms race, but it eventually ended because one of the parties, which was running in this race, that is the Soviet Union, it withdrew, consequent upon the collapse of the Soviet Union and its disintegration into 15 Union republics. So this arms race did not lead to a war eventually, primarily because one of the adversaries withdrew midway and therefore the arms race was terminated. But in other cases, you would find that a lot of arms races would eventually lead to some kind of a conflict between the adversaries between whom the race occurs. So whether an arms race increases or decreases the risk of war, it is something which is debatable, because people who are in favor of getting more and more weapons to bolster the security of their respective countries would argue that arms give us security. Whereas people on the other side who are against such kind of an arms race, they would say that when so many weapons are being built up in two countries, most of the times they would be geographically close to each other also. So when weapons are there and when that amount of weapons are there, they are bound to lead to some kind of use of these weapons, and that could lead to violence and war. Some analysts agree with Sir Edward Grey, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time of the World War I, who argued that the moral is obvious. It is that great armaments inevitably lead to war. So he is just articulating the same opinion, that when you have so many weapons amassed in your country and in the country which is the adversary, it is bound to lead to some kind of a conflict. So therefore, it's something which is eventually very dangerous. Now, many definitions have been given of arms race, but basically it is a pattern of competitive acquisition of military capability between two or more countries. So sometimes in an arms race there could be more than two countries also in that kind of a race. This term is often used quite loosely to refer to any kind of military build-up or a spending increase by two countries or a group of countries. The competitive nature of this build-up often would reflect, obviously, an adversarial relationship between and among the participants of that arms race. The concept is also used in other fields. However, here the discussion in this segment is limited to only military arms races. Now, the military arms races could be of various types. For example, the nuclear arms race. So the nuclear arms race is an arms race between two adversaries who happen to possess nuclear weapons. For example, America and the Soviet Union were both nuclear weapon states, and they were involved in some kind of an arms race. So the United States cast a wary eye over the Soviet Union's quest for world dominance as they went on expanding their power and influence over the Eastern European region. And the Soviet Union in turn resented the United States geopolitical interference and the buildup of weapons, which was happening in the United States of America. So both these things, fueled some kind of distrust. And therefore, because of this distrust, when the United States decided to actually drop an atomic bomb in Japan on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, they did not inform the Soviet Union. Although they had informed the Soviets that they were in possession of such a bomb, but the decision, which was a very momentous and important decision, that they were actually going to use that bomb in Japan, that was not communicated to the Soviets. And to help discourage Soviet communist expansion, because Soviet Union was on a project of expanding communism in other countries of the world, so United States went on building its atomic weaponry. But eventually in 1949, the Soviets also tested their own atomic bomb, and then started the nuclear arms race between America and the Soviet Union from 1949 onwards. Now, in that arms race when both these countries were nuclear weapon equipped states, they now are trying to have an upper hand in terms of the quality of that nuclear weapon or nuclear option which either of them had. So United States in 1952 tested the highly destructive hydrogen super bombs, and the Soviet Union eventually was able to detonate it in 1953, only 1 year later. 4 years later, both countries tested their first intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the arms race and the nuclear arms race rose to a very terrifying new level. So now what happened, that both these countries were nuclear weapon equipped states, and now they had ICBMs, that is intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could be used to deliver these weapons across the world. So therefore, that made them very dangerous, because in matters of nuclear weapons, which are highly destructive, and weapons of mass destruction, any kind of deployment of nuclear weapons in the war theater, when any of those countries were thinking on those lines, would have turned out to be extremely destructive for either of them or both of them and the rest of the world as well. Then the next category in this could be the Cold War arms race. Now the Soviets, who launched the first Sputnik satellite on October 4, 1957, they stunned the US, and the United States got concerned, and the rest of the world also got concerned, because the arms race, in that Cold War era, now had reached the space. So the arms race, which was usually in matters of conventional weapons, and as we just now discussed, it went on to the category of nuclear weapons also, was now transported to the space race. President Dwight Eisenhower tried to tone down the rhetoric to some extent or the success of the Soviet launch, and while he on the other hand gave a lot of funds to the US space program to ensure that they were not left behind the Soviets for long, and the United States could also respond by having its own satellite launched in the space. So after a series of experiments, many of them failed, the United States was finally able to launch its first satellite into space in 1958. So just in a few months' time, because the Soviets did it in October 1957 and the Americans did it on January the 31st, 1958. So within a few months, they were able to work on that and were able to launch their satellite in space. And therefore, eventually what happened, that the space race continued, and both countries were now able to qualitatively add to that race, and they were into researching new technologies to create more powerful weapons, and not only weapons, but they were also trying or into research for creating better surveillance technologies. So both these things, were obviously very dangerous for rather both these countries as well as obviously other countries of the world, because if some kind of a military conflict would have ensued in their space, it would have consequences for other countries as well. Now, throughout the 1950s, the United States was quite convinced that the Soviet Union had better missiles and its missile capability was superior to it. And if the Soviet Union launched its best missiles, the Americans did not have any defense against them. This theory was known as the missile gap, which was eventually disproved by the CIA, but not before much concern was caused to the US officials. Now, this game of perceptions, which happened in many other arenas of warfare, but which happened here in relation to the missile gap, is something, which is extremely important to understand. Because in an arms race, when both countries or two countries are running side by side, there is extreme trust deficit. There is total distrust between both the countries. And there are a lot of fears. So one party is always fearing that the other party would be having better weapons than it. And therefore, it is always trying to have some better weapons than the other party. And similarly, vice versa on the other side, the other party is also trying to do the same. And therefore, both parties try to run as fast as possible to have some kind of advantage over the adversary. And that leads to a very ferocious kind of arms race, which is endless. The problem with the arms race is that it is endless because there is no end point. Both the parties, both the countries are running parallel to each other. And these parallel lines never meet. So it is an endless race. Many politicians at that time used to call the missile gap, as something very important. And in fact, in the 1960 presidential elections in the United States, this was a very important issue, that which candidate would be able to rather bridge over this missile gap and bring the Americans at par with the Soviets. Yet, the fact was that ironically, the American missile power was superior to that of the Soviet Union at that particular point of time. And as a result of the arms race, what happened that over the course of the next few decades, both these countries were able to add more than 1,000 warheads to their armory or to their weapon capability in terms of the kind of missiles which they had and which they were able to make, better, more dangerous missiles, and of course adding to the firepower of those missiles, the accuracy of those missiles, the distance which the missiles could hit in every possible way, qualitatively and quantitatively. Both countries added significantly to their existing missile arsenals. Now what happened that in the Cold War arms race, it came to a tipping point in the year 1962 after the John F. Kennedy administration, because John F. Kennedy was the president of America at that point of time. They tried and they failed to overthrow the Cuban government of Fidel Castro. And when they were trying to do that, the Soviet Premier Khrushchev, he implemented a secret agreement between the USSR and the Cubans, and it was agreed that Soviet warheads would be deployed in Cuba to deter future coup attempts by the Americans. After the US intelligence people observed that there were missile bases which were being constructed in Cuba, they decided to enforce a blockade on the country and demanded that the Soviet Union demolish the bases and remove all those nuclear weapons which had already been deployed on the Cuban territory. Because the American thought that this is something, which is too much, because Cuba was next to America geographically, and if the Soviet nuclear missiles were to be deployed on the Cuban territory, on whatever pretext it might have been, that would have been very dangerous for the Americans, and the American policymakers were not going to take it in any way. So that's the reason they gave a warning to the Soviets that if you don't withdraw these missiles immediately, maybe a third world war is going to start. So that it was a very tense standoff between the Americans and the Soviets, and because both the Kennedy administration on the American side and the Khrushchev administration led by Khrushchev on the Soviet side, they were very adamant in their respective stances, and they exchanged letters and made demands on each other. So the situation became very tense. Eventually, fortunately for both these countries and for the world as well, the crisis finally, ended peacefully. However, both sides, the Soviets and the American public, had, in the meantime, they had very fearfully braced themselves for the nuclear war. And many people, especially in the Western world and America especially, had started to question the need for weapons and the kind of weapons, which assured that both these countries would be mutually destroyed. So the very argument of nuclear theologians of mutually assured destruction was questioned by people, and by many scholars, because they thought that it's no use having these kind of dangerous weapons because they assure destruction of both sides. And if one side eventually commits a mistake or misunderstands the issue or has some kind of misperception or some kind of misunderstanding, and by mistake, even if that weapon is fired, it would lead to a destructive war which would eventually lead to the rather extinction of the whole human civilization. So therefore, that kind of an understanding, that kind of a logic, that kind of a theory of deterrence is something which was being questioned by a lot of scholars and even by the general public in America at that point of time. But the arms race continued, between America and the Soviet Union, and as I mentioned earlier, it only came to an end in 1991 with the final collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and eventually, the destruction of the Soviet Union into 15 Union republics. And years later, but slightly earlier, than that, in the year 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union had signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is known as the INF Treaty, to limit the scope and reach of all types of missiles. So some kind of, disarmament measures had also been taken by both these parties. But the logic behind these disarmament measures was also questioned by a lot of scholars, because many people argued that this was just to show to the world that both these countries are actually interested in disarmament. But actually the reason was that they had been able to build so many missiles that they had reached a point of overkill, and they did not need those missiles, especially the intermediate range nuclear forces, because now they had got short range nuclear forces and long range nuclear forces, which were rather to be used through the intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the intermediate range nuclear forces were not very much required, and therefore they did this just to show to the world that we are very sincere in terms of disarmament, although the arms race was actually going on, and it only ended when the Soviet Union finally collapsed. So there were other treaties, which were concluded, like the START Treaty in 1991, and then New START Treaty in 2011. They were also aimed at reducing the nations or these countries, ballistic weapons capabilities. But these things, what were the consequences and what was the logic, we would be discussing in the next section, when we will talk about disarmament and arms control. Now, eventually, the United States finally decided to withdraw from the INF Treaty in 2019. And the argument was that the Russians were non-compliant to the treaty. So now that is something, which is very important to understand in relation to arms race. When arms race is going on between two big powers, so even if some agreement is reached, like the INF Treaty, which was signed in 1987, the INF Treaty, could not be actualized in the real sense. Why? Because both the parties were totally distrustful of the other. So the Americans thought that if we start destroying our missiles and the Soviets do not do that, they would always have an upper hand over us. And the same understanding was there on the Soviet side. So what was the consequence? That none of those countries, actually did something substantive in relation to reducing their missile capabilities. And eventually in 2019, here America is deciding and announcing that it is withdrawing from this treaty because Russians were not compliant. So the basic problem with such agreements is verification, how to verify and how to satisfy yourself, because it is something which is so very important. What is at stake is the survival of a country. So therefore, in matters of survival of a country, how can a power have faith on its adversary? So whatever measures are taken, whatever means of verification are devised, they will always fall short of your expectations as a power which is involved in an arms race with its adversary. And that is the reason why these measures of reducing weapons, of limiting weapons, or any kind of understanding, even if you try to develop, the momentum of the arms race is so overpowering that all these things, are rather eventually fall prey to the obsessive fears which operate in the minds of both the adversaries. And because of that strong sense of fear and distrust and the fear of cheating on the other side, that both parties blindly go forward in the arms race and continue to do so endlessly. So therefore, that is the reason that many people argue that even though the Cold War is over, Soviet Union has disintegrated, now it is Russia, but some kind of an arms race is still continuing. Although it is not so apparent, it is not so noisy, it is not so clear to the world, but still, even today, United States considers Russia as its number one military adversary, and same rather kind of understanding is there in the minds of Russians as well. And some kind of an arms race is continuing between both these adversaries even now. And now, there are other countries of the world who have continued to beef up their military might, and they are involved in modern day arms race, or they are on the verge of entering some kind of an arms race. Like for example, there is an arms race which is continuously going on. Sometimes it is aggressive and sometimes it is latent, but it continues between India and Pakistan. On the other hand, we see that arms race is going on between North Korea and South Korea. And similarly, there are many other adversaries in different parts of the world between whom some kind of an arms race is continuously going on. And especially, when two countries are geographically positioned close to each other, like India and Pakistan and North and South Korea. So in that case, the distrust is even higher, and the arms race, it is very difficult to put some kind of a limitation on the arms race which ensues between such kinds of geographically located countries, who are adversaries and who have some kind of, animosity with each other. There are many kinds of arms races in the world, and there could be many examples which are very instructive to understand, how arms race operates. And one important example is the example of the arms race between Germany and Britain before the First World War, which is known as Dreadnought. What happened in the early 20th century? Germany was a rising power, and it sought to challenge the United Kingdom's traditional naval dominance. At that time, the naval dominance was the most important thing in terms of military capability. And in the year 1906, the Britishers launched a new, more advanced warship. And the name of the warship was HMS Dreadnought. And it triggered some kind of a naval arms race. So between the year 1909 and the outbreak of the World War in the year 1914, Britain launched a further 19 dreadnoughts. These were turbine-powered big gun warships. And it also launched additionally 9 battle cruisers. And on the other hand, to compete with them, the Germans launched 13 dreadnoughts and 5 battle cruisers. Many people argue that this arms race, which started between Britain and Germany at that point of time, was one of the main causes of the World War I. Although there are other explanations and many people disagree with this, but the argument has been very strongly given by people who believe that when there is a weapons build up, as we have already discussed, in two countries who happen to be adversaries or competitors, the possibility of a conflict increases manyfold. So many people therefore have argued that because of this dreadnought arms race between Germany and Britain, that was the basic reason that laid the groundwork for the First World War to start, and eventually which lasted for several years and which was one of the most violent wars in human history. So here we stop in this session, and next we'll discuss certain things about the arms race more in the next session.